Welcome to Unsafe at Any Click, Internet Safety Lab's podcast exposing and exploring unsafe software behavior. This week, privacy advocate Zach Edwards returns, joined by ISL's Technology Director Irene Knapp to discuss the Gravy Analytics data breach, the RTB data broker supply network, and so much more.
All right, we're going to get started here. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our sixth podcast, first podcast for 2025, and really excited to have a new face and a familiar face joining us today. Bryce and I are your regular hosts here, and today I'm going to start with Irene Knapp, who is our ISL Director of Technology, and we have been really looking forward to having Irene on a number of times, but it's finally happened, and we're happy about that. Hi, Irene. Yeah, well, thank you. And then also we have the familiar face of Zach Edwards with us back again.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back.
Yeah, thank you. And I kind of I feel like I should do a big disclaimer at the beginning that we are going to get geeky in this talk. This is not going to be for the faint of heart. Like, this is probably going to use some terminology and acronyms and a whole bunch of details that we really want to get to the bottom of some thorny questions. So buckle up is my thing to say. Okay, so the topic that we're going to talk about today is it's the Gravy Analytics data breach that was an interesting thread that was pulled to reveal some interesting connections. And I think, Zach, I want to start with you to maybe you want to kind of summarize that whole situation for us.
Sure. So Gravy Analytics is a data broker. It's been around for a while. And much like many of the data brokers that exist, we don't really know the sourcing for how they get their data. And so most of them they tell you how many people they're tracking. They brag about all the size of their audiences, but they never say, we get it from the bidstream. We get it from these apps. And so this recent incident occurred where basically Gravy appeared to have been, compromised by a threat actor who eventually leaked some of the details online. And those details happened to uncover mobile apps where they were collecting data from. And so it raised immediately a whole bunch of questions for researchers of, are there any commonalities between these apps? How did Gravy get this data? Do they have deals with all these app developers? And as also, when this news was coming out, the app developers themselves were raising their hands saying, we have nothing to do with Gravy. We don't have a relationship. We don't know if this is factual. And it really was kind of this interesting mystery. But what all of us and other experts appreciated was that Gravy was not going to have some SDK integrated into all these apps. They didn't have direct deals with thousands of apps. That's laughable. They were getting the data from the bidstream, the advertising bidstream. And so I think having that as the foundation for this discussion, I think is really smart, because I think everyone needs to understand that Gravy is just one company that is getting data from the bidstream, and it's a much larger problem.
Yeah, and you should articulate what kind of data it is, because this isn't just any old data, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's location data. I mean, it can be some of the most sensitive stuff that you're putting out there. So not only are you basically broadcasting maybe what apps you use, which was absolutely sensitive for certain dating apps, certain communities, but having it associated to your location data is what really makes this into something that can dox anyone from the most sensitive and private people who work in the Pentagon to priests that lives down the street who has a personal life to everyone in between. And I think that it's important to also appreciate that the data that leaked, the sample of the data and what we saw, every single piece of that data was connected to a mobile advertising ID, either created by Google or by Apple. And both of those companies basically create an ID on people's phones if you don't have this setting turned off. And if you basically have a few of the consent buttons you click and a setting or two you didn't toggle off, this ID is broadcast out onto this advertising bidstream as you use apps. And it becomes available to track your location, your interests, and it's deeply invasive. So yeah, that's a great point. The data, what's being collected certainly is of deep importance.
Yeah, well, I think that's what makes this case in particular so interesting. And another thing I want to ask you just broadly about is who are Gravy Analytics data customers? Who are they selling data to?
Yeah, so it's commercial and government sources. And much like a lot of other data brokers, they're trying to get that sweet government money. And so they customize their offerings so that it appeals to certain government agencies. So we don't know all of the live clients that they use, but there are absolutely government agencies. I think ICE is a good example, the Immigration's Customs Enforcement. They are absolutely trying to acquire certain data to track, quote, illegal immigrants. And you could imagine that any agencies like that would have an interest in certain types of data. But then it's also sold to commercial interests. And a lot of folks, from private investigators to other adtech companies, but some of the sort of additional harms that can come from this type of data sale. For instance, a lot of this location data started to be sold around COVID. So when COVID happened, there was a huge increase in the number of data brokers that were working with location data. And a lot of large finance organizations and banks were buying that location data in order to better understand basically the number of people that were going into various retailers, and they were shorting stocks or buying stocks based on retail foot traffic and the decreases that were occurring during COVID. And so they were basically trying to predict revenue decreases based on brick and mortar shops having decreases in foot traffic. And so that basically, those types of macro harms where there were absolutely people gaming finance markets using location data derived from the advertising bid stream. And there's literally live webinars where people were during COVID sort of bragging about these use cases. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of people that buy this data, and some of the purchases can be a little surprising why they may do it.
Yeah. Okay. I want to go straight into mapping out the actual possible flows for how data goes from the real-time bidding protocols ultimately into data brokers. So we're going to do that. Irene, any thoughts, any additions on that before we go into?
No, it's great, Zach, that you have all those news stories prepared to really give some color to this, because I think a lot of people would not understand what location means. It's your home address, which you should already be concerned about. It's who you spend time with, who you visit, all that. But it's a lot more than that. It's of interest to a lot of different people, as you enumerated. And I thought that was, it was lovely that you were able to give all that depth on that.
I appreciate that.
Okay. So let us go. Let me just tee up the right slide. You all have seen these. I am reusing resources that I found, and I'll go ahead and put this in screen presentation mode, just so it's okay. So this is from the Irish Council on Civil Liberties. You can't see it, but that's their little watermark. This is some of the excellent work that Johnny Ryan and company have been doing for years on the largest ongoing data breach of real-time bidding, and just tremendous materials there. Highly recommend it. We'll put the link we'll do a little blurb on their link so you can see this directly. But I really, really like this picture. This picture gives a real sense of the scale of data sharing in terms of recipients. It's not telling you how much, but it's showing you every little one red line in here is a little bit of personal data that goes out when there's one single empty ad space on a page or an app, and it starts the bidding process and says, hey, I need an ad. I need to get an ad for this spot. And it sends out a request, a bid request, and it starts off innocently enough to a single like SSP, but then you can see each ad exchange that it goes to will propagate it to potentially, I think we get into the thousands potentially pretty quickly of these DSPs. And now maybe we should say a little bit about what these entities are. Who wants to take a
I'll
crack
take
at
that
that?
one.
Okay.
I'll take that one. So DSP and SSP, first off, don't feel bad for not remembering these terms. They are frankly bad terms. DSP stands for demand side platform. SSP stands for supply side platform. You shouldn't try to remember that, frankly. All the money in advertising flows from the advertiser to the publisher. That's what you actually need to remember. And so
where are the advertisers here, Irene? We don't see them on this slide. Where would you put them?
They would be buying through the DSPs, so that massive fan out. And that's what you'd expect, right? Because anytime you as a person visit a website, say NewYorkTimes.com, they're the publisher, right? In the top left of that diagram, person looks at a web page or an app. Doesn't have to be the New York Times, could be Blue Sky, could be anything with ads in it. And then it fans out to all through all this advertising infrastructure, which we'll get into the structure of, but it ultimately reaches all the potential advertisers who might want to buy something there, who might want to buy an ad. So the advertisers are the ones who are buying something. They're buying advertising space, right? So they are demand side, and the publishers are the ones who have captured you. They have a supply of you, so you are supply side, okay? Or the publishers are supply side rather. You're what's being supplied, right? So
it's so funny because that is such a funny way, and perhaps tiniest bit cynical way of regarding that. I've never thought of it that way. I thought that the supply was, we've got this little office space here, this little office space of an ad, and this is the supply,
Well, it's true, right? But it would be fraud if they sold an ad that nobody was looking at, right?
Yeah.
The fact that somebody is seeing it is an essential part of what they're providing.
No kidding. Okay, so I've added a couple labels here. I'm going to continue to do this sort of thing. Yeah, good.
That's super helpful that you can do that and illustrate what I'm talking about in real time. Yeah. So the demand side platforms, the DSPs, are all those dozens in your example of fanned out services that are working on behalf of advertisers. They're like, we're going to sell you our service that does advertising for you. It's a platform for you, the advertiser. You're the demand, so it's a demand side platform. And through the ad exchanges, which are the two, right there to the right and there to the bottom, those are the, real-time bidding exchanges that make the connection between, and they do this in real time. That's the real time, before you even finished loading the website, it has already talked to all these people. And the ad exchanges are responsible for doing that and for implementing that fan out, we call it.
Who are some ad exchanges?
Google has one, Microsoft has one. I'm gonna mess up because I know all these things and not all of them are current. I didn't fact check it, but there are a bunch of large ad companies. So those two are names you've heard of. Many of them are names that if you don't work in advertising, you have not heard of, but they're very big names within advertising. There's, about a dozen of these that are super commercially relevant. And then there's hundreds more exchanges that mostly kind of subsist by buying on other exchanges. And they're trying to get into the more predatory position someday.
Okay. So then let's just kind of talk through a flow. So an ad and a request comes out of the web page or the app, and it comes here, and it gets propagated to all the DSPs, and then some number of these DSPs will respond and say, "Ooh, I got an ad. I got an ad." Do they all respond? Or most of them? What
Not
happens?
necessarily. It really depends on how much they think this user is worth to them. And kind of part of the reason that it is all this fan out is that they each have their own way of assessing that. They all have their proprietary data that they don't necessarily trust each other with, because they would steal from each other if they could. I know.
Okay. And so then presumably a bunch of responses come in, and then one gets chosen by, where does it get chosen? Who chooses the winning ad?
Choices happen both at the various exchanges and at the what you've marked supply side platform there, which is very slight oversimplification. There may or may not be like an ad network in the loop, kind of between the SSP and the ad exchange, or the SSP may be acting as the ad network and directly connecting to the exchanges. But that's ultimately the decision point, because that's where that's where it has to pick one to return. It got all these responses. One of them has to go back and actually fill the ad slot.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's talk about like what kind of personal. So Zach's already mentioned that the mobile advertising IDs, or ID for advertising, is getting passed in here. And we're going to come back to this because that's not the whole picture of, those aren't the only IDs that are going across we've seen. So we're going to come back to that point. But what else goes out in this bid request?
Potentially a lot of things. Now, it will vary case by case, so I'm giving examples. Potentially your name, potentially, what you were looking at, like what page this is. Oh, I was shopping for shoes. This is somebody who's interested in this style of shoe or whatever. I was watching a video about cars. I must be somebody who likes cars, right? Interest categories like that. Potentially all sorts of things. Anything the site has about you. It may include your demographics if you've ever told them that.
Location also, like, let's bring it home to the Gravy case. It's
that's what I said in addition to.
Yeah. So is there any control, like who controls that, what gets put in that? I mean, clearly the website or the app has the ultimate control, right? Because that's where the source code is. But
Yes.
Are there any is it configurable at all for end users?
For you? No, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry.
Yeah. I had to ask the question, right? I mean,
no, it's a good question. It's a good question because people should understand that answer. Like, that's not really what any of these opt-out switches do. They aren't giving you like, don't tell people my ethnic background. It would be nice if they gave you that, but they don't.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Is there any, so we kind of get a sense of how this is going. I think, Irene, one thing you shared with me is that the winning DSP may have access to additional information in the full fulfillment of the whole protocol of the, from request to response to completion and whatever. So
yeah, just to situate that a bit for people so that they can connect it to their own knowledge. The winning ad is code that runs inside the page, right? It got to be displayed in the page. That's what they paid for. And it isn't just a picture. It can do additional data gathering and get a lot of stuff like that. Additionally, exchanges may choose to share more information because they may, that may be a value add that they offer.
Yeah.
And I actually I think that's such a super important point. I want to reiterate why I think that is. So one of the really interesting changes with this type of architecture. So the last couple of years, there's been scandal after scandal where sensitive data was flowing through the advertising system into China. And so Google, which is the largest exchange, kind of the largest entity within a map like this, basically said, you know what? we're going to change the way we do some of our advertising. So whenever advertising these sort of signals about we have ads available, the auction signals, whenever we're sending out the data with that to all of these DSPs and advertisers, if the data is going into China, we're going to strip away the mobile advertising ID. We're going to partially redact the IP so they only get a partial IP. We're going to remove sort of all these different details. So really all that's being sent is someone is on this specific website or app. Here's a partial IP and here's the user agent, the type of device they're on. But what's interesting or problematic and why it's relevant is the whole concept of when you win an auction, you get to deploy more code, collect more data. Therein lies the rub. So I always like to say red money spends green. And Google has taken just huge amounts of money from some of the largest like e-commerce retailers in China, and they're allowing them to win just a massive amount of these auctions. And when people are like, gosh, I see Shein or these other sort of Chinese clothing stores following around the internet, their ads are constantly showing, that means that Chinese retailer is overbidding, winning the auction, and then when they win that auction, they get an opportunity to sync their own favorite JavaScript vendor, collect additional data that they can probably access. And so I think it's always such a really important point, because that really wasn't a case where maybe a few years ago, Google didn't have redaction systems like that. They hadn't acknowledged the risks. And so we're at a place where major companies are acknowledging the risk to share data into China from this mass bid stream, but still allowing those Chinese companies to bid and then collect data on the back end. So
yeah.
I'm super happy that you're able to like add color to like the Google side of the story here, because I'm not at liberty to talk about any of that, of course. And
absolutely,
it's very helpful that you do, because I'm in full agreement with you.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So when we kind of zoom out and think about this in terms of the leakiness, the personal information leakiness, there's two tiers. Like there's a real incentive incentive to win a bid, right? And the prize, the door prize to winning an auction is that you can put your own little harvester in place.
That's true, but there's also a flip side to that. So there's an interesting unknown statistic. So this is a Google stat that has never been made public, but I do know it exists in some form or fashion, where when an organization is secretly collecting data from this advertising bid stream, or this has happened apparently in the past, they don't really actually have clients. They don't actually have advertisers who are like, I want to get my ads on all these websites. And so they ingest more bids than they respond back to with ads. And so the percentage of basically how many bids they receive compared to how many they win is very, very low. And basically there's some unknown threshold where if you basically don't respond to enough bid requests, Google does something and bans them, or basically put some alerting on you.
They're eavesdroppers. They're just eavesdroppers collecting data.
And so there's this happy medium where there's absolutely some sort of threat actors in the advertising ecosystem who kind of just sit there, and they actually never want to win auctions. They want to just get all the data for free and never have to pay for any ads. And that's also why they segment some of these things by country. So sometimes an organization may only get access to certain data in certain countries because it can be so sensitive. Unfortunately, most organizations can get access to the U.S., so it's not like this is some silver bullet solution here, but it is. There are some interesting precautions that have been made that really aren't public in very big ways, but kind of rumors in the industry and whatnot that this exists.
Just to riff off of you, Zach, I've always felt that these things, need to be public. Like, it's hard to say that because it's an adversarial thing, right? You describe exactly how the precaution works and people know exactly how to subvert it. but the companies would like us to like believe, oh, we do a lot of secret stuff to protect you. Great. Then tell us about it and tell us whether it works and to what extent it works, because the public is a stakeholder here.
Exactly.
Like this is not a thing these companies do out of the goodness of their heart. It's they are the ones who created this danger by making the opportunity for it.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that's a great way to put it. And they are keeping details like this private because they think it's an adversarial. It is an adversarial system, but by not acknowledging that there are thresholds and like alarm bell systems that exist like this, people in regulators, other researchers don't appreciate that that's a place they should look. That the advertiser who never wins an auction is just as suspicious as the advertiser who wins every auction.
Well, as somebody whose job included responding to regulatory inquiries, I deeply wish that regulators around the world knew the right questions to ask. I deeply, deeply wish that they were better at understanding this ecosystem themselves and digging into it all.
Well, maybe this will help, this podcast. I mean, regulators are our customer at ISL. And really what this is, what's screaming out to me is like, who is regulating this? I don't think anybody, like if we're relying on the industry that created this toxic infrastructure and system to govern itself, well, that seems misguided. And I was going to also make the observation that it's interesting to me that we've gone so far in this discussion without mentioning the people responsible for the standardization of this protocol, or at least one of the standardizations of this protocol, which is the Internet Advertising, whatever they are, IAB. What is the B? Yeah.
Bureau.
Bureau, yeah. So the Internet Advertising Bureau, this is a public standard. This whole protocol and the attendant infrastructure that supports it has been publicly available for years, and nobody outside, I think, of the advertising ecosystem ever looks at it. Like IETF, nobody's like really looking critically at it like, hey, this is a like kind of adjunct ecosystem built into the internet, and yet there's no governance. And I don't know. Any thoughts about that?
Personally, for me, this is my white whale. And really getting back to the history, the IAB is a new organization in the terms of this. The Media Rating Council is the reason why there's no regulation on the advertising industry. And what I think the history of this is a little obscure and it's a little bit maybe even disputed. But in the 60s, there was basically in 1960 there was hearings about whether the advertising industry should be regulated. And there was a series of hearings because there were all these scandals in the late 50s of just garbage ads. People like, drink lead, it's great for your bones, like just pure bullshit. And so they basically were like, yeah, maybe we should have standards for ads. And there was this huge pushback. I literally have a copy of the entire like multi-day hearing in these big black binders sitting on this bookshelf over here, where I basically reviewed the transcripts from the 60s about the things that the industry was saying about why they were better at self-regulating. And so this whole, and it was back then, it was the Broadcast Ratings Council, and it turned into Media Ratings. It's evolved into what it is now. But the whole reason why no government agency regulates it is because in 1960, they convinced a bunch of members of Congress that, oh yeah, we got this. And we've just been rolling with the literal same organization, still giving the credentialing process for half of ad tech as like the main entity that's supposed to police this. And Congress is basically out to lunch. They haven't even reconsidered holding hearings again, when if you look back at what was discussed in the 60s, it's not even relevant to what we have now. Like they were talking about 14 TV channels, 50 FM. It was just like a little thing. It could be absolutely managed by an industry that was somewhat had their stuff together.
Yeah, it
But
was like a
now,
one way. It was one way
exact.
material. Now we've got this interactive little stalker surveilly interactive things. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and Lisa, the other point I make about that is you can't even know what ads other people are seeing. We have this like political micro-targeting
Yep.
these days. It used to be that when you turned on your television, you would see the same ads everybody else in your city was seeing. That is no longer the case, not even with most things that you think of as television these days. But I'd like to speak to, because you did a great job of like explaining what self-regulation is, the idea that companies should hold themselves accountable. And that gives me a nice chance to say one of the things I like to say, which is it does not work. Okay. I went into, when I joined Google, I came from an ideological background, which I was distancing myself from, but I was in the process of learning. And I was predisposed to believe that self-regulation was like the morally proper way to do these things. And I was like, oh, I'm part of the people protecting the public, right? I'm keeping everyone safe. And the company absolutely still very much thinks of it in those terms. I knew when I spoke to the people who did, public policy advocacy on this topic, they still believe, they still say, they still teach everyone self-regulation is the way to go. And I am here to tell you it does not work. And the reason it does not work is what you do is you hire a few dozen people who care very much and want to help the world. And you give them enough work that you would need a few thousand people. And that's it. All that C-suite has to do is not allocate headcount, that is, not hire enough people for the job. And that's all they really have to do to make sure that everything winds up being broken and ineffective. There are allegations I won't speak to in various ongoing lawsuits that like upper management's interference in these protections may have gone beyond that. It sounds like they have strong evidence to support those claims. I hope that it's proven in court, because the public deserves that accountability. But I'm only basing that on having read court filings, you understand. It's quite a thing to read court filings about your old workplace. Anyway, enough of that.
Yeah. So, okay. So this was a great discussion. We're going to move on to this next slide, because who we don't show in here is who is a data broker? Where are the data brokers in this? And how, like, so, and where is Gravy in this kind of picture? I'm going to use a different picture. This one came from this Ad Ops Insider. It's quite old. It's 10 years old, but I like it because it's colorful and it's easy and it has a smiley face on it. So, this is just another way to look at the same thing, and it shows us a little bit more about the protocol flow here of how the fulfillment of the ad actually happens. And I put some notes over here. These are my notes. Let's see here.
The diagram shows the user doing like 5 things. And just for the sake of clarity, I'll point out like you did one thing. You visited like NewYorkTimes.com, but your browser did these other 4 things for you.
Yeah. It is interesting though, because this the depiction here kind of underscores your comment from earlier about, you are the
product.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You're giving something to all these companies. They happen to get it kind of in a obscure way. It's not a direct connection. And I think that's part of the lack of control for folks. Like, hey, I have a relationship with the publisher website, not who are these other people?
That's right. And that's why our label, by the way, like, so I have to put the plug in, the reason we do the work we do is because 1, industry doesn't govern itself, and 2, because we don't know. We have this relationship with the site that we're on or the app that we're using, and that's who we expect to get our data. We don't expect to have all these other strange third parties, but our safety labels actually expose who's actually receiving it. It exposes all of these other kinds of entities. And so what the note we have over here is that any entity that gets its hand on a bid request has access to personal information. How is that? It's because it's got a join key. It's because it's got some way to associate the little payload of data that it's got with a unique human being, whether that, again, is the mobile advertising ID for advertising, that the platform gives it, the operating system gives it. And I don't know if I have the comment on this slide. Yeah, I do. So this is where I just want to underscore the point that these identity resolution platforms and this alternate, commercial surveillance ecosystem that it overlays on top and integrates within this, they also have a universal identifier that gets passed along in real-time bid requests. So even if Google and Apple were to remove the advertising IDs, we still need a lot more entities out there in the world to remove the identification tags. So
yeah, and hashed email schemes are becoming more and more popular. So I think that's the other flip side, where when third-party cookies were being deprecated, the solution, the privacy safe solution, was for all these publisher websites to basically, as you're logging into their service, they basically take your email, they hash it, and then they just start broadcasting that hash out so that it's a consistent ID, so that advertising companies can do what's known as frequency capping, so they don't show you the same ad too many times. They're pretending like it's a service for the user to basically broadcast this ID that can allow them to be tracked. And one of the sort of shocking things about these hashed email schemes that I just want to highlight is that they can actually be sometimes even worse than the mobile advertising IDs, because Google and Apple's mobile advertising ID, while underpinning the vast majority of current data broker schemes and doxing location and all these types of harms, those IDs rotate every 30 days automatically. So every 30 days, there's some loss in tracking. You have a possibility that maybe you won't be associated back to that past month's behavior. But these hashed email schemes, there's no requirements. There's no hard-coded requirement to rotate that ID. So some publishers likely are basically generating that hashed email, and for months and months and months, they'll just keep on sending that whenever you're logged into their service and whenever they want to send out your data for this advertising. It may be getting worse than better.
I think it is. And by the way, I think even just rotating every 30 days, I think these identity resolution platforms are getting so many sources of data that they're able to triangulate so much better and determine it, do that resolution. So it's less effective. Zach, how do we associate those hashed emails with also these adtech, martech initiatives of UUID 2.0 and EUID, which are basically look like the same thing with different names?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there's organizations trying to standardize various hashing schemes, and it's mostly because simplest way to think about it is it's an anti-privacy scheme where they basically want to create a system so that if everyone uses the same hashing standards and those standards are all garbage, if the same user with the same email address goes to one publisher website and it's hashed with an algorithm, and they go to another site and hashed with the algorithm, it would be the same hash. And so some of these, they don't even salt them. They're deliberately making them the same hash across. And so it's like opposite from the way security works, where they're trying to prevent hash conflicts, trying to prevent hashes from being able to be created from it's just a whole lot of anti-privacy work in order to track people better.
And it angers me very much that they call it privacy work and that they say, oh, we're protecting you all by keeping you safe by surveilling you. It's very angering, and it's even more frustrating that so few of these companies really get called on that everybody just lets that rhetoric stand.
Yeah. It's an assault on privacy is what it is. It's an absolute assault on privacy, and it's an assault in the form of universal identification that none of us have asked for or consented to. And I think anger is the appropriate reaction to that. So
just briefly, as a California resident and folks in Europe and a variety of other states that have privacy frameworks, we have concepts of like right to say no, like transparency requirements. And so I think a lot of these publishers are cruising for a bruising, where they've integrated this directly into their login systems, and they don't have a toggle that says don't hash my email and send it to adtech. They explicitly don't have that, and they maybe let you opt out of, like, you may have that pop up when you load the website for the first time, but they really are not integrating that into the login experiences, and I think it's extremely deceptive. So
Yeah.
TBD on that, but there's a lot of publishers that think that they can do anything that they want with user data, including broadcasting it. And there was recently a pretty major a sports organization who was caught up in that. I think maybe the FTC just recently put that out, but there are organizations that are being investigated for their sort of publisher schemes. So
Good.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Okay, so we want to get to the closed loop of how the data brokers are getting their hands on this information. So what I've done is I've taken this little picture and I've added something that we've been encountering quite a bit, and it's these data management platforms. And we're seeing more and more of these in ad tech companies. And I'm hanging them off of these DSPs. And remember, these DSPs are listeners, right? They're just sort of like, they get all of the ad requests coming in, meaning they get a lot of data coming in. And so what they're doing is they're aggregating that data, storing it, enriching it, remembering it, whatever it is they're doing. The one thing I want to distinguish this from customer data platforms, because we've written about that. And the one unique thing, and I think that this line is getting blurrier. And I would reckon that this is maybe not even a real line at all. It's a hopeful line, but I don't think it's a line. The data management platforms don't usually ingest from external sources to aggregate in that way. CDPs are architected to absolutely do that. But I think, again, that line is like, I see you, Zach, shaking your head. Yeah. I think it's probably wishful thinking, maybe, that they're not ingesting other sources of data
Like, it's
to
a socially
enrich.
defined category. Like I said to you the other day, Lisa, like the DMPs are serving an audience who are serving companies that are just perhaps a little bit more mercenary than the CDPs are, even though they are doing fundamentally most of the same things.
Yeah. Yeah. Good distinction.
And one thing I have heard that DMPs do connect up to external sources would be their IP address to location tables. So they'll get the IP address from these websites, from like the clients and everything they're collecting data from, but they don't intrinsically know the location of that. And so they buy services, they use various things to try and be like, this person's in Chicago, this person's in blah, blah, blah. And so there are some integrations into these, but I think that in terms of how you're sort of differentiating that, where largely one has Facebook and every social media and advertising network pumps in, and this other one is more like a bulk data store. I think that is a good way to think about it. And I think the only caveat I was going to have to just do it, and why I was sort of shaking my head just a little, was I think ad tech companies have always done this to some degree, but it's basically becoming more and more useful. And I think that as they started to think that the third-party cookie was being deprecated, so we're 4 or 5 years into when those discussions first started happening, the whole industry started changing. And they basically said, oh my goodness, I can't store my data on the customer's computer anymore. I need to have just archives of everything we've ever done, new ways to track this, new partners. And so there's been an evolution in the last 5 years, I think, in response to they were going to lose some signal, and they no longer are. The deprecation isn't happening anymore. And so they're sort of, they found solutions to track people even better, and they get to keep the legacy method. So
yeah,
I'm really frustrated that the spinning down of third-party cookies, that those talks broke down. It would have been a good thing. It would have been.
It would have been, but I think to Zach's point, it fostered and catalyzed the creation of these identity resolution platforms and customer data platforms and these data management platforms. And you go to any one of those sites and they will say it right there. like cookie lists, blah de blah, like they're proud of it.
It created a revenue bubble, in my opinion. All of these digital strategists and people at these businesses said, "Oh, I'm going to lose access to this. How can I do this in a different way?" And like I said, all these hashed email schemes are garbage. They're total BS. They're worse than legacy methods, current methods, and so their solutioning for this is likely going to get them caught up in courts. They're tracking people. They're broadcasting interests. A lot of these companies just don't know the technical of what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing to their own customers. They don't know that hashed email scheme isn't just helping them to avoid seeing too many ads. It's giving a join key to data brokers to track their customers. And
I get upset anytime I see frequency capping exceptions listed anywhere. I've seen them in draft legislation, and I'm like, this should not be here.
It's exactly. COPPA. In COPPA discussions, they talk about it all the time. That's why they can't get anything into COPPA other than the behavioral ad removal, because as soon as they start to try to talk about ad removal, which they should be talking about, and no, they get immediately to the frequency capping.
Yep. They want to be able to frequency cap across websites and apps, and that's where if us as consumers, we just say, look, all I want to do is if I'm on one website, I would like to only see a certain number of ads from the same person on that website. If I go to another website and I start seeing those same ads again, like that's just the cost of business. Companies are going to have to either agree that that's acceptable.
Yeah, I know. Like I do not care about the ads. Do whatever. I don't anyway. Okay, so let's get back to this. So then let's talk about data brokers. So what we think is happening, and I will shift over to the Gravy slides in just a second, but what we think is happening ultimately with Gravy is that there's a data management platform that is literally selling the data to Gravy in some way, or somehow getting it to them. Maybe we should flip over to the Gravy slide.
This is speculation. We don't have proof of this.
That's right. Yeah. That is all correct.
And I wouldn't even say it's a data management platform. It's just call it an adtech company. Let's put adtech right in the name there, because it's not one of these data storage companies. I can guarantee you that. Guarantee. I'll give you the Cajun guarantee. No, it is going to be one of these adtech companies that basically says, I'm getting consent to market to these things based on my relationship with the ad tech companies, and I'm going to write myself a little Alberto Gonzalez torture memo, and I can do whatever I want with that data on the back end, and then they are the ones that's selling it. It is some entity that has access to the bid stream, and there is two companies that we've just jumped into allude to how this could be going on.
Yeah. So let me I want to underscore what you just said. Anybody who's got access to the bid stream. So that's all of these little boxes on this slide. All of these entities have access to the bid stream. So all of these could be doing this kind of data transaction. So, and they could be data brokers. They could be registered data brokers, I should say. Because
good point.
Yeah.
There's plenty of unregistered data brokers, and the fines certainly aren't discouraging people from not registering.
They're ineffective. So, and we're gonna be publishing something about that, hopefully, God willing, tomorrow. That will we've added data brokers to our safety labels. We're actually pulled out the number of registered data brokers, because we can't say unregistered. Like, we're working on a better, more rigorous definition that doesn't get us into
we have to say
hot soup on that. Because we have something to say about, this registered data brokers. What about all the ones that aren't registered, and what about the shortcomings in the data broker law and definition to begin with? So it's a deeply flawed estimation of just how much trafficking of personal information is actually occurring. That's a problem. So let us jump over to this. I have a whole bunch of slides. I think I'm just going to buzz through this really quickly just because I think it's kind of interesting. I wanted to figure out the companies involved in this, and it was extremely difficult, not just because of the fact that we were dealing with non-US Lithuanian companies, but also because it was just super confusing. There were DBAs involved. It seems it's unclear, and maybe the DBA became the business entity at some point. So we had this original company, and I found documentation that said it was doing business as Eskimi, and then later I found a registered business, Lithuanian business of Eskimi UAB. So I don't really know, something magic happened. But certainly this company Eskimi is a DSP, and they had a DMP that was in documentation that I found called Kafka. So, yeah.
Amazon Kafka, right? Yeah. So
that's what the, okay.
Yeah,
that sounds right. And Lisa, just because our audience may not necessarily know what a DBA is, the brand that you see is not necessarily the company's legal name. They are doing business as this brand name. And so it can be difficult to trace through their corporate structure just based on public records, as you've done.
Yeah. So then the other company that was implicated in the findings about Gravy Analytics was RedMob. And so what's that?
Technically, it wasn't implicated in the Gravy Analytics. They're two separate scandals.
Oh, tell. Okay, clarify.
Yeah, so the Gravy Analytics was a hack, and that's basically we learned that they were collecting data from all these apps because that was exposed, and the only way that they could have collected that data was theoretically through the bidstream. There was no common SDKs. The RedMob Eskimi is a situation where a data broker who basically was tracking U.S. soldiers in Germany told members of Congress and reporters that they bought this data from Eskimi. And this business basically came out saying, we bought this data from Eskimi. And Eskimi actually has a blog post where they said, we've never sold this data. We're not a data broker. They parse it really a fine line. And it's incredibly interesting how full of shit, in my opinion, RedMob is.
They've never sold it, but they've sold the use of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, they basically said, we're not selling it. And I said, okay, are you giving it away? Like, the way that they framed every single sentence is just a series of like, that seems like you wrote that in a way just so that you could not say that you lied. But let me just break it down for everybody. There's a company called Eskimi who has access to the global advertising bidstream. Very big company, lots of real refutable clients, relatively normal. Everything seems normal. There is now another company called RedMob, and RedMob is a data broker. They're not even a registered data broker because they just, are honey badgers about it, but they openly track over 1 billion people every month, and they sell data to track these people, their location data, a variety of interests. Now, the CEO of Eskimi and RedMob are the same person. There's other staff that basically are shared between these organizations.
Yeah,
and no one could figure out how RedMob could possibly get 1.3 billion details to track 1.3 billion people per month unless it's through the bidstream. And so it is highly suspicious that Eskimi is saying they didn't sell the data, but RedMob is clearly the source that sells the data. And RedMob has never explained where they get their data from. And so the world is sort of left to guess and to speculate. And instead of RedMob putting out any details explaining what they're doing, how they got their data, their relationship to Eskimi, Eskimi instead put out this obfuscation, kind of this ridiculous statement. And so Eskimi has promised legal action. So we're actually, a lot of us are waiting to see if they file legal filings against the company. So
they're promising to sue themselves effectively, or their partner. And they come out in court as a result of this process.
Exactly. They're promising the most exciting discovery the world has ever seen, because they're basically, if they end up suing, then yeah, everyone's going to get a real close look at the relationship between Eskimi and RedMob. And I look forward to trying to support Yeah, I hope I'm included in the lawsuit, to be quite honest. I got my fingers crossed, even though I just provided a comment for one of the stories, but you never know with this type of organization.
Yeah.
It's super interesting to me that totally vindicates I can't tell you how many hours I went down the rabbit hole trying to figure out the relationship between Eskimi and Red Mob, because I was like a dog with a bone with this. Like I was determined to make sense of it. I have up here on the Wayback Machine of the Red Mob privacy cookies, whatever thing it has, but you can see clearly they have a DMP. And so I'll walk you through my discovery process of this, because it was okay. So thanks for sharing that. I wondered, I don't know, I think it was mentioned in the same article, so I got a little bit lost in the weeds there. Okay, so
Sure.
I started off with Eskimi, and yeah, this is the guy's name, right? This Vitautus Pauxtus. Anyway, so I started off with just making sense of Eskimi, and then I wanted to figure out like Red Mob. Okay, so Red Mob, there's a number of corporate entities. I mean, I'm telling you, I was deep in this stuff. And I was looking at the registries in the Europe and India and everywhere. And so and Lithuania. And so it's clear though that this Red Mob UAB, the Lithuanian company, is the one that seems to have this adtech infrastructure. And then trying to piece it together. So then there's also this Red Mob FZCO, that's the most current one. Like this was the OG, I think, the Red Mob UAB. And then somehow now it's Red Mob FZCO, which is Free Zone Company. And this is, where is this? UAE?
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. So this is the company that you appear to be interacting with today if you were to become a customer of them. That is the public-facing company. And so presumably then they are the one responsible for the DMP for the data, like for the DSP and the DMP of the data that is being
They don't really have
propagated.
they don't have a DSP per se. I mean, at least to my knowledge.
Well, really?
My understanding is it's just a data broker. They just basically will sell you data. They don't. It's not. I mean, I imagine they could connect it up to Eskimi pretty easily. I bet they maybe could figure that out. But
look,
yeah.
By the way, here's this same company, DBA as Red Mob. So they seem to have a habit of like spinning things off as DBAs and then giving them corporate
structure is very mutable. It just, anyway.
Okay, so that's interesting. So then it's just a DMP.
Yeah, it's just basically somebody is giving it the data. It's just dumping it into a data store and then chopping it up and selling it. It's just like it's like a data broker.
Red Mob
unmarked
DSP.
White van.
But they're saying Red Mob DSP.
I mean, it's possible that I honestly I think they had language about activation, which is typically you send it to another ad tech company. But I didn't see anything about actually delivering ads. So they may be kind of...
Well, they may not be delivering ads, but they seem to have an entity that's listening to ads, to the bidstream.
No. That would not be the way I would... It sends eligible data. They're not authorized buyers. Red Mob is not an authorized buyer. They're not listed in the authorized buyers program. Only Eskimi is. Eskimi is currently to this day listed, and so that's the question with Red Mob is they do not have they do not have direct access. Somebody behind the scenes is handing this to Red Mob, and the most obvious source is Eskimi.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so just to put a pin in this, so Gravy has nothing to do with this, so this guy comes off of here, but there is this, so you can see here my question marks of like Eskimi, and actually I think I have this screwed up a little bit because I think it is this. No, Red Mob. Yeah, so Eskimi, Red Mob, the current company, there's some kind of questionable relationship there. And that's what so I'm glad I'm in good company because apparently nobody knows what that relationship is right now. It's the same guy.
The relationship, it's same CEO, same employees.
Yeah.
So
yeah. something funky going on.
You
Okay,
don't even, yeah,
so
yeah.
okay, so that remains to be seen about that data supply. Now let's go back to Gravy Analytics, and I'm going to stop sharing because that picture is just wrong. But Gravy Analytics, let's talk about where so it's getting location information. It does not have SDKs, so far as we know. So it's not directly harvesting, right?
They could have SDK relationships, but the people that analyzed the breach data and tried to find common SDKs were not finding anything. There was no obvious group of like 5 SDKs they're working with. It was, and so most people kind of say it's probably not via SDKs, but the way that I've also heard it described is a data broker like this will take data from any source. And so if an SDK maker comes to them and says, hey, I have an SDK in 600 apps, you want to buy it? They will probably buy that. And so when you're looking at a corpus of 30,000 apps or some large corpus, there could absolutely be some segment in there that maybe is actually given via SDK, which will be really tough for us to figure out. So
yeah, fun. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit to what would make this safer for human beings? What are some basic measures that should be in place? And for instance, the fact that we don't have this kind of disclosure, like that these companies aren't disclosing all of their sources of where they're getting data. Let's just have a little roundtable on that for a minute.
The only thing that would frankly, the only thing that would really make people safe is not having this real-time bidding infrastructure, and that's not the answer anybody wants, because oops, all the money is gone. But
Okay.
you know, yeah.
So what I think this is a worthwhile discussion, though. Like, I do think the world should be pushing back on the IAB and these real-time bidding protocols and say, you have to do it safer. And Zach, your answer early on at the very beginning was remove the maids out of the, like minimally remove the identifiers out of here.
And I think it could be even more broad than that, because as soon as you remove one, another one pops back up. And it's more, if you're creating an ID, you're responsible for the logic behind it and the safety of that ID. So if it doesn't rotate fast enough, if it's generating the same ID for multiple companies, it is creating, like, the concept of a data controller responsibility is important to appreciate. And basically every business, from the publishers who are hashing emails and broadcasting them to the companies like Google and Apple who have these these mobile advertising ID schemes, if they are generating the same ID and transmitting it to more than one company, they've created a tracking vector. And my hope is that we start to hold these companies accountable in just plain language of, you're tracking people, you're not disclosing it properly, and you're helping multiple companies. You aren't just tracking people, you're facilitating thousands of companies to track your customers. And then basically, because this whole system even exists, just acknowledging that self-regulation has been an abject failure, and we need some entity to get into the nuts and bolts of this, so that we're not trying to solve this problem one civil case after another. We need holistic rules and frameworks, so that if you're creating an ID and broadcasting it into the world, you're exposed to those harms that come back on the people that you do that to.
And I really like your angle, Zach, of regulate the identifier owners. Because those are, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Apples, and enforce that they have things like, you sort of said this in language that I understood, but to make it like for our audience, enforce that they rotate it frequently so that people can't be tracked over time, enforce that they don't send the same one to different companies so those companies can join it and do things outside of that control, etc. I really do like that angle, because it's true that the the identifiers have a very far-reaching effect.
I appreciate that. And whenever I talk about the identifiers or think about it, one of my favorite stories to tell is the story about IAB China. So IAB, the Interactive Advertising Bureau that sets standards for the world, there's a version of it in every country, and there's a version in China. And a couple of years ago, they wanted to actually have a new ID, and they wanted to use the IMEI, which is basically hard-coded into your phone. Hard-coded into your phone. And the
Telecom
IMEI,
person. Yeah.
I knew it was
Yeah,
going to go
exactly.
this way. When you said IAB China, it was like, I know exactly where this is going. Not to be all nationalist about it, but anyway.
Yeah, it's one of those IDs where it's the hard-coded thing in your phone that connects you to the cell tower when Salt Typhoon compromises our telecommunication and tracks the president and other people. They're tracking the IMEI, and it's a very, very invasive ID. And IAB China was basically told, don't do that, buy the CCP itself. And it was literally one of my favorite examples where adtech was too invasive for the Chinese Communist Party itself, who track everyone on mainland China and everything you do is monitored. But they said, no, that's a bridge too far, y'all. And they basically said, don't do that. And so, I think that.
Because it could be used against them, why? I mean, that's my guess. Of course, I don't know this, but anyway, go on.
Yeah. So, okay. So just to kind of like wrap things up here. So what we learned today is that the connection between the real-time bidding infrastructure, I'll call it, and data brokers is that any of the entities that have access to the real-time bid stream can, and many are, monetizing that data either as registered data brokers or unregistered data brokers.
Exactly. The trillions of auctions every day are being scraped, and we're the product.
Well, the other overlay I want to add is like this is but one mechanism that in what we, the paper that we wrote last year about this surveillance infrastructure is that there's also just the APIs that are, doing mass imports of customer databases into identity resolution platforms and customer data platforms. And so there's this sort of transactional aggregation, like the slow drip or fast drip, if you want, of the real-time bid stream. But then there's also just the, like, open an artery and send your entire database over into this other platform to be commingled with other customer databases into an ever-growing, massive Uber, consumer database. And there's multiples of those.
Important angle for regulation, just to highlight what I heard you say.
One of my favorite examples of that is the Adobe audience that they had, where basically for years they had this thing that you could basically opt into, or major companies were opting into it. And it essentially was this program where they were going to help everyone collaborate and better understand your audiences. And they tracked every single person across all the different brands with the same exact cookie ID for you. And so anytime you showed up anywhere, they would know whether they would be able to track it back to you. And they eventually disbanded it because the whole thing was wildly non-compliant. And it was just a fun reminder that companies will do really whatever they want to make a little extra money, and only some of them actually have the ethics to roll it back. And so I like to criticize Adobe, but also they deserve lots of kudos for being one of the few companies that actually sunset a product that was unsafe that many other companies still have.
Here's another one that I learned just yesterday. Salesforce. Salesforce had a DSP and an ad network and something else, and it was all an audience product that they had, and that was sunsetted last year, in theory. I assume it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, the Blue Kais of the world. Blue Kai was sunset.
Blue Kai's another one, yeah.
Yeah, there's absolutely been big companies that have sunset or big products, and yet then there's a whole other sectors of the industry that have a different legal opinion on what is appropriate. So,
okay, so any last thoughts on how we can? What should ISL do? Last thoughts around the board here. What should we do that we're not currently doing?
I want to be able to do that kind of bidding analysis, that analysis of where the data came from anytime there's a leak. I want to get us a nice productionized workflow that integrates with our database and does that.
Ooh, let's write up a quote for that and see if we can get that funded somehow. Yeah.
I personally think that more talking points and more information sheets for legislators, where I like to think about ALEC, so that ridiculous organization that writes bills for certain legislators.
Yeah.
They may be ridiculous, but they're very effective, and they have because they're talking about niche issues. They're like mostly tax reform, so it's stuff that it does require expertise to write it. And so just appreciating that the more information that you can get into the hands of even just state legislators, it can be surprisingly useful. And so like literally trying to find ways to email all the state legislators in the country, I'm not sure how every state works, but there may be some sort of message board where you kind of put your message up there and be like, hi, read this note from us, whatever's appropriate in each state. But like the concept of trying to get the word out there that we have some tech policy sheets would be interesting.
Yeah. Bryce.
I'm a second Irene there. I would absolutely love that and would do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah. Okay, one last thought. You watered the seed here, Zach. One of the things one little tiny piece of regulation that would make our lives easier is if all companies, not just public companies, were mandated to disclose all of their revenue streams, including the monetization of personal information but we need more than just monetization. We need like any kind of sharing or in-kind kind of, usage of that. But that was one thing that I would like to have.
Well, the reality
Go ahead.
The reality is that maybe they should be required to, because it is a future risk that they're not properly disclosing in SEC reports. So the way I would think about it is if you're using user data for current revenue generating efforts, you should be required to disclose that, because with ever-changing requirements and perceptions, that revenue could dry up. And so you should be required to tell investors how much you make from it so that they could properly plan about whether you've created yourself a revenue bubble by sort of committing to data as a source of revenue.
Yeah.
Good argument. I like that.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that. That's really interesting.
But yeah, transparency rules can be very powerful. Because when malfeasance happens, we aren't left like grasping out, okay, what is the connection? How do we link up this to this to this to this? How do we prove it? Because they were required to disclose the thing, so you can just look at it, right?
Yeah.
Without that, can we really say that there is corporate accountability?
Yeah. Nicely said. I think we're going to end right on that, because that was really nice. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much. And I feel like this was really a great discussion, and I really appreciate you all being here.
Really lovely to speak to everyone. Really lovely.
Yeah, it's great to speak with you, Irene, and everybody, Lisa, Bryce. I look forward or hope to be able to do this again in the future. I hope we can schedule something. It'll be fun.
You know it. We will.
Okay. Good.
All right.
Good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Unsafe at Any Click, a production of Internet Safety Labs, and join us next time as we poke around under the hood of software to identify, quantify, and expose invisible safety risk. Internet Safety Labs is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in the digital world. You can support this podcast and other resources by making a donation at internetsafetylabs.org.